Tucked under the checkbook register was a torn corner of newsprint. He pulled it out. It was a tiny, snipped-out headline fragment. Loyalty questioned in. The rest was torn away. His blood turned to ice. It could be from anything. An article about a sports team. A political scandal. It was a meaningless scrap. But placed here, in this drawer, found on this day after the photograph, it felt like a message. A whisper. Loyalty questioned. He heard a floorboard creak in the hall. He shoved the clipping back, closed the drawer silently, and flushed the toilet for cover. When he returned to the table, his heart was a trapped bird. He looked at each of them, his father, cutting his meat with trembling hands, Maya, clearing plates, David, telling a bland story. Were they performing? Was the clipping a plant, designed to be found? Was the person who framed him not just out there, but right here, passing the gravy? The love he once felt was still there, but it was buried under a kilometers-thick layer of permafrost. To reach for it was to risk a fatal exposure. He left early, pleading a headache. His father's goodbye hug was stiff. Maya looked worried. In his car, before starting the engine, Jon got out and quickly checked under the wheel wells, behind the bumpers. Looking for a tracker. He found nothing but road grime. Driving home through the dark streets, every pair of headlights in the rear view felt like a pupil. The cozy houses he passed were no longer homes, they were fronts. He arrived at his sealed vault and went through the locking ritual, but it felt hollow. The threat wasn't outside the door. It was in his phone's memory, in his sister's hesitant pause, in a scrap of newsprint in his father's desk. The photograph on the table seemed to pulse in the dark. They had infiltrated his geography and now his history. The circle was tightening, but from which direction? He had tested them, and all he had found were more questions. The only thing he knew for certain was that the anonymous me from the past had finally broken cover. And they were close enough to touch his life, to rearrange its furniture in the dark. The clipping was a seed. It grew in the dark soil of Jon's mind, sending out tendrils that connected everything. He began to see the patterns. Not grand conspiracies, but tiny, almost invisible fractures in the surface of his world. 3 days after the dinner, he opened his laptop to find his digital calendar had been altered. A dentist appointment for Thursday at 2 p.m. was gone. He'd never canceled it. He called the office, his voice carefully flat. "Yes, Mr. Carter, you called and canceled yesterday afternoon," the receptionist confirmed. "Did I sound like me?" A confused laugh. "I suppose? You knew your patient ID number. You said you had a conflict." He never gave that number out. It was stored in his password manager. A manager with a single, complex master password he'd written down and kept in a sealed envelope in his safe. The safe showed no signs of tampering. The next pattern was auditory. Walking back from checking his mailbox, a journey he now made in a different, random pattern each day, he passed old Mr. Hendricks washing his car. The man nodded. Jon nodded back. As he walked away, he heard it clearly. "Loyalty has a price?" He spun around. "What?" Mr. Hendricks looked up, hose in hand. "Sorry, son. What did you just say?" "I said, this nozzle's not very nice. Clogs if you look at it wrong." The old man shrugged, turning back to his Ford. Jon stood frozen on the sidewalk. He had heard the words. He had. But the old man's bland, puzzled face was a portrait of innocence. A auditory hallucination? A product of his sleepless brain echoing the clipping? Or had Hendricks said it, and instantly, expertly covered? The patterns bled into his work. A research request came in, via his secure freelance portal, asking for a deep dive into declassified files on Cold War-era, false flag disinformation campaigns. The client's name was listed as M. Chalice. The payment was substantial, upfront. It felt like a taunt. He accepted the job. The data was all public record, but curating it was like walking through a museum of his own ruin. The most chilling pattern was spatial. Things in his house maintained a subtle wrongness. The angle of the toothbrush in the holder, bristles facing left instead of right. The volume knob on his stereo, which he always kept at an even number, was set to 13. The book on his bedside table, A Dense History of Naval Cryptography, had a crease on page 47, where he'd left off. Now, a single short sentence on that page was underlined in faint, precise pencil. The most effective lie is the one the target tells himself. He hadn't done it. He stared at the line, his breath shallow. This was beyond moved objects. This was communication. Intimate, patient, and designed to show total access. He made a list. It was the only way to quiet the storm in his head. A list of every person who could theoretically access his life. Maya had a key for emergencies. New childhood details, his fears. Motive? Inheritance, perhaps, if their father's will was a trigger. But Maya had always been his defender. Unless that defense was a long con. David, Maya's husband. Practical, connected. Accountants knew how to hide things. A potential access point through Maya. But a motive was obscure. Ben knew his routines, his past, his psychological weak points. Had been there before the accusation. Could there have been jealousy buried under decades of friendship? A resentment of Jon's early success at Kronos? His father, Robert, the most painful possibility. The one whose disappointment would cut the deepest. Did part of his father believe the old lies? Could shame have curdled into something twisted, a desire to prove the accusation true by making Jon crack? And then there was Elena, his ex-partner. She'd stuck by him for the first year after his release, a rock against the tide of his paranoia. Until she couldn't anymore. "I love you, Jon," she'd said, her face hollow with grief, "but you're trying to pull me into the cell with you. I can't breathe." She'd moved across the country 5 years ago. He'd heard she was a psychiatrist now. An expert on the mind. On trauma. Could she be them chalice? M for medical? Chalice? A cup to hold something? A vessel for poison? He was spiraling. He needed to ground one fact, just one, outside of his own perception. He drove to Grayson Park. The bench sat under a skeletal oak, yellow leaves littering the ground just as in the photograph. His heart hammered against his ribs as he approached. He half expected to see the red X painted on the wood. There was no X. The bench was just a bench, weathered gray slats. He ran his fingers over the place it had been in the photo. Nothing. He sat down, the cold of the wood seeping through his coat. He felt exposed, a target on a stage. A woman with a dog walked by on the path. A man jogged past, headphones on. Normal life, oblivious. Then he saw it. Carved into the leg of the bench, small and old, the wood darkened with time, were initials. JC plus ER. Jon and Elena. He'd carved them there a lifetime ago, the summer they'd met. He'd forgotten completely. His vision tunneled. The park, the city noise, the smell of autumn, all of it fell away. The photograph hadn't been sent to show him the bench. It had been sent to show him their bench. And only 2 people in the world knew what those initials meant. One was him. The other was Elena. The pattern wasn't a scatter of suspicious dots. It was a line, drawn directly from the white room of his past, through the ruins of his heart, and ending right here, right now. The culprit wasn't a faceless phantom. She had a name, a face he had loved, and a profound understanding of how to break him. The whisper from the shadows finally had a source. And the betrayal was so perfect, so complete, it felt less like a stab in the back and more like the ground beneath him turning to air. Knowing was worse than suspecting. Suspecting painted the world in shifting shadows. Knowing lit a single, glaring spotlight, and in its beam stood Elena, not as a memory, but as an architect. The patterns stopped being subtle. The day after the park, a package arrived. No return address. Inside, nestled in gray foam, was a small, porcelain figurine of a dancer, one arm gracefully extended. It was chipped along the base. Jon stared at it, nausea rising. He'd bought this for Elena on their first trip together, a silly souvenir from a seaside town. She'd loved it. It had sat on her bookshelf for years. After their final, shattered goodbye, he'd assumed she'd thrown it away. Now it was here. A relic of love, repurposed as a weapon. There was no note. The message was the object itself. I have kept this. I have kept pieces of you. I own your past, He threw it in the trash. An hour later, digging through the bin in a cold panic, he found it was gone. The bag hadn't been collected. He searched the entire house. The dancer had vanished. That night, the nightmares changed. They were no longer replays of the white room and the calm voice. Now, Elena was in them. She was the one asking the questions in that sterile space, her therapist's tone gentle, probing, surgical. Why do you think they chose you, Jon? What is it about you that screams, guilty? He'd wake gagging, the scar on his jaw throbbing. The digital world became a funhouse mirror. His carefully curated news feed began populating with articles about psychiatric malpractice, about therapists who manipulated their patients into false memories. An anonymous email arrived with the subject line, treatment plan. The body contained only a link to a private, password-protected server. He didn't click it. He knew it would be something designed to unravel him further. The most brutal game was auditory. He'd hear her voice. Not in the dreamy haze of near sleep, but in broad daylight. The soft exhale she used to make when concentrating, coming from his empty home office. The snippet of the old jazz song she'd hum, drifting from the vent. He'd tear the room apart, silencing the HVAC, holding his breath, met only by a mocking silence afterward. He understood the strategy. She wasn't just threatening him. She was recreating the conditions of his breakdown. The sensory deprivation, the psychological torment, the erosion of reality, but from a distance, using the very intimacy they'd shared as the delivery system. She was proving her thesis, that his mind was a fragile, programmable thing. That he was, and always had been, fundamentally unreliable. He couldn't go to the police. My ex-girlfriend, who's now a psychiatrist, is sending me meaningful souvenirs and gaslighting me. He could hear the patronizing calm in their voices, see the exchange of glances. She'd foreseen that. She'd made her movements legally untouchable and psychologically devastating. He had to prove she was here, physically, in the city. He had to catch her in the act. He began a counter-surveillance of his own life. He bought burner phones, cheap motion-activated cameras from different stores with cash. He set them up in his foyer, facing the mail slot and the front door, disguising them among bookshelves and in potted plants. He dusted the surfaces of his furniture with a fine, transparent talc, checking for disturbances. For 3 days, nothing. Only his own lonely, frantic movements captured in grainy night vision. On the 4th night, a camera triggered at 3:17 a.m. He woke to the alert on the burner phone, his heart hammering. The video was 10 seconds of his dark, empty foyer. The mail slot didn't move. The door didn't open. Just an empty, silent rectangle of his home. He was about to dismiss it as a glitch when he saw it. In the corner of the frame, on the small table by the door where he kept his keys, a shadow moved. Not a person. The shadow of a person, cast from outside, passing by the narrow window beside the door. A silhouette, sharp and fleeting. It was too androgynous to identify, but it was there. Someone had walked up to his house in the dead of night, lingered just out of sight, and left. They weren't just in his head. They were on his porch. The knowledge was a lightning strike of pure adrenaline. This was no longer just psychological warfare. This was a physical presence. The line had been crossed. Driven by a feverish courage, he threw on a coat and slipped outside into the freezing night. The street was deserted, pooled in halogen light. No cars, no figures. He walked to the edge of his property, his breath pluming white. There, in the frost-rimmed grass of his front lawn, just beyond the reach of the porch light, he saw them. Footprints. One clear set leading toward the house, another set leading away. And beside them, pressed into a patch of soft earth, was another, smaller print. The distinctive, zigzag tread of a running shoe. A woman's size. The world went very still and very clear. The evidence was literally at his feet. He pulled out the burner phone to take a picture, his hands trembling not with fear now, but with a savage, vindicated fury. As the camera flash illuminated the ground, he saw the final touch. Placed carefully in the center of the larger footprint, as if it had fallen from a pocket, was a single, white business card. He didn't need to pick it up to read the elegant, raised lettering in the flash's brief glare. Dr. Elena Rossi, MD, PhD, Psychiatric Trauma and Rehabilitation. By appointment only. It was an invitation. A taunt. A signature. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was showing him the mask. The professional, helpful, healing mask. She was telling him that the only person in the world qualified to treat his madness was the one who had meticulously engineered it. And she was waiting for him to make the next move. The business card was not a loose end. It was a leash. She had dropped it the way a hunter drops bait, knowing the specific hunger of their prey. Jon held it between his fingers, the crisp stalk feeling like a scalpel. By appointment only. He didn't call the number. He went hunting. Her professional website listed a downtown office with sleek, glass-fronted photographs. He went there first, a ghost in the morning commuter crowd. The building was modern, sterile. He saw her through the second-story window, standing in what looked like a consultation room, talking to a man in a suit, a colleague, or a patient. She wore a tailored blazer, her hair shorter and sharper than he remembered. She gestured calmly, authoritatively. Seeing her in the flesh, a real person moving in real time, short-circuited something in him. This was no phantom. This was the woman who had held his hand as he shook through withdrawal from the medications they'd forced on him after his release. The woman who had whispered, "I believe you," into his hair in the dark. Now, she was the source of the poison. He needed to understand the why. The motive was a locked room in this labyrinth, and he needed the key before he confronted her. He turned to the one source she couldn't control, the past. He drove to the next town over, to a library with public archives. He requested old local newspapers from the year of his arrest and the years before. He wasn't looking for his name. He was looking for hers. For her family. For a crack in the timeline he'd lived. He found it in a Society page blurb from 9 months before his world ended. Local tech heir Mark Rossi returns from overseas charity work. There was a small, grainy photo of a smiling young man with Elena's eyes. Her older brother. Jon had met him once or twice. A quiet, serious guy headed for the family's defense contracting business. A business that, Jon soon discovered from follow-up articles, was locked in a fierce competition for a lucrative government contract. The main competitor? Kronos Defense Technologies. Jon's employer. The next article was an obituary. Mark Rossi had died in a single-car accident on a rain-slicked road 4 months before Jon's arrest. The article quoted a grieving father and a devastated younger sister, Elena. Jon sat back, the microfilm reader whirring softly. A puzzle piece, sharp and cold, slid into place. He remembered a night, deep in his ordeal, when Elena had visited him during one of the brief, supervised allowances. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "I lost someone too," she'd said, clutching his hands. "It makes the world feel like a hostile place. You have to find someone to blame or you drown." He'd thought she was talking about losing him, about his incarceration. He'd poured out his gratitude for her understanding. Now, he heard the sentence differently. You have to find someone to blame. He dug deeper, his fingers leaving smudges on the screen. A follow-up business journal piece, 6 weeks after Mark's death, noted that the Rossi family's firm had withdrawn from the contract bidding process due to a period of reflection and restructuring. Kronos won the contract. The project lead on the Kronos side, the man whose work sealed the victory, was a young, promising systems analyst, Jon Carter. The air in the library was thick and still. The why was no longer a mystery. It was a monument. He had been the face of the rival firm that profited from her brother's death. Not the cause, but a symbol. A convenient, tangible focus for a grief that had curdled into a need for vengeance. She hadn't just wanted to hurt Kronos. She'd wanted to annihilate the person who represented their triumph, to prove that their victory was built on a lie. She had made him the author of his own destruction, using the language of the state to do it. And when the state had let him go, broken but alive, her work had been unfinished. He drove to her apartment building, an upscale complex overlooking the river. He didn't have the code for the main door. He waited. At 7:30 p.m., she came out, dressed for a run in leggings and a zip-top, her breath fogging in the evening air. She turned left, heading toward the Riverwalk path. He followed at a distance, his pulse a steady drumbeat. The path was mostly deserted in the deepening cold. When the last cyclist passed, he closed the gap. Elena! She stopped, her shoulders tensing. Slowly she turned. Her face showed no surprise. Only a weary, profound recognition. She pulled an earbud out. Jonathan, I wondered when you'd come. You wondered? His voice was low, scraped raw. You left me a calling card. I left you a choice, she said, her therapist's calm utterly intact. To keep living in the nightmare, or to walk to the source of it. The source is you. He took a step closer. The river churned black beside them. Your brother. You blamed me. You blamed Kronos. So you made the tip. You framed me. She studied him, a clinician assessing symptoms. The man I loved was consumed by the same machine that chewed up my brother and spat out a press release. Mark killed himself, Jon. The pressure, the failure, the family couldn't bear the shame. We buried it as an accident. And Kronos threw a party when they got the contract. So you destroyed me to get even. I didn't want to destroy you, she said, and for the first time, a crack appeared in her calm, a flicker of desperate intensity. I wanted to reveal you. To show you the black heart of the world you were so proud to be a part of. I wanted you to see it from the inside, the way Mark saw it. I thought, if you experienced it, you'd understand. You'd come out on the other side, and we could be together in the truth. He stared at her horrified. You had me tortured. For 2 years. To make a point? The torture was never part of the plan. The words burst from her, sharp and defensive. The tip was anonymous. I just provided the narrative. The evidence. I thought they'd investigate, question you, maybe fire you. I thought it would humble you. Open your eyes. I didn't know they'd do that. She wrapped her arms around herself. When I saw what happened, I tried to fix it. I retracted. I said I was uncertain. You retracted? The world tilted again. You were the witness? The impeccable source? She nodded, once, her eyes glistening in the dusk. I had to. I couldn't let it go that far. But by then, it had its own momentum. They held you anyway. And when you came out, you were broken. You were everything I hated about the system. Paranoid, closed off, damaged. My project was a failure. Your project. The word was more monstrous than any insult. And then you started to get better, she continued, her voice regaining its analytical tone. Just little things. You left the house. You saw Ben. You were trying to build a shell of a normal life. You were forgetting the lesson. You were just becoming a sad, middle-aged man with PTSD. The symbolism was gone. She met his eyes. I couldn't let that happen. I had to remind you. I had to show you that the fear is real. That I am real. That the world is not a safe place. It's the only truth that matters. Jon stood frozen, the pieces of his life reassembling into a grotesque new picture. His great tragedy, the defining crucible of his existence, had been a graduate-level experiment in social psychology and personal vengeance. His tormentor was not a faceless spy or a government brute, but the woman he loved, armed with a grievance, a psychiatrist's understanding of trauma, and a brother's grave. The love he'd felt for her was now the core of the poison. It had all been real to him. For her, it had been part of the methodology. You're insane, he whispered. No, she said softly, finally taking a step toward him. I'm the only one who sees you clearly, Jon. Always have. And now you see me to. Here we are. What's your next move? She was offering him the final twisted gift, the truth. And with it, the unbearable weight of what to do with it. The truth was not a liberation. It was a heavier prison. For 20 years, his cell had been built of unanswered questions. Now the answers were the bars. He stood on the riverwalk, the wind cutting through his coat, facing the architect of his ruin. Elena waited, her expression one of exhausted expectation, as if she had just finished a difficult but necessary therapy session. What's my next move? Jon repeated, the words tasting of iron. The cold air sharpened the clarity that had settled over him, a terrible, frozen calm. You need me to have one, don't you? For your data set. Will he seek revenge? Will he crumble? Will he finally understand? You're still running the experiment. Her composure wavered, just for an instant. This isn't an experiment. It's a resolution. No, he said, taking a step closer. He saw her flinch, a micro-expression of fear she couldn't suppress. An experiment needs control. You lost that the moment you walked onto my porch. The moment you became a physical fact and not a ghost. He held up the business card, then let the wind snatch it from his fingers. It tumbled toward the dark water. You've shown me your hand. Now I show you mine. He pulled the burner phone from his pocket, unlocked it, and tapped the screen. He held it up so she could see. It was a live feed. Of her own apartment. The camera, one of the cheap ones he'd bought, was nestled in the potted fern on her bookshelf, showing her living room in grainy, green-tinged night vision. Her breath hitched. How? You taught me to check for trackers, he said, his voice flat. You never taught me not to place them. You were so focused on being the predator in my territory, you forgot to secure your own. He'd done it that morning, after seeing her at the office, using a lock-picking technique he'd learned not from spies, but from a paranoid online forum. A final, pathetic skill from his damaged life. What do you want, Jon? The clinical tone was gone, replaced by a thread of real alarm. I want you to listen. He switched the app, pulling up an audio file. He pressed play. Her own voice, crisp and clear from the porch camera's microphone, filled the space between them on the deserted path. I didn't want to destroy you. I wanted to reveal you. I thought if you experienced it, you'd understand. The torture was never part of the plan. He stopped the recording. A confession, Elena. To conspiracy, to filing a false report, to psychological torture. Enough to reopen everything. Not to the men in suits, they'd bury it again. To the press. To a civil lawyer who'd take a percentage of the settlement from your family's remaining fortune. Her face was pale in the twilight. You destroy what's left of my family? After what they've been through? You used your family's grief to destroy mine, he said, and for the first time, a tremor of raw emotion entered his voice. You took my parents' son and sent back a haunted stranger. You took my future and made it a bunker. You don't get to talk about family. He saw the calculations racing behind her eyes, legal, reputational, financial. She had imagined many outcomes to her grand design, but not this. Not a quiet, procedural counterattack using her own tools. What's your offer? She asked, the therapist negotiating now. There is no offer, Jon said. There are terms. You will write a full, detailed confession. You will name the specific contacts you used to plant the initial evidence. You will send it, along with this recording, to a lawyer I designate. It will be held in escrow. You will then check yourself into a psychiatric facility, a real one, for a minimum of 6 months. You will get treatment for whatever this sickness truly is. And if I refuse? Then the file goes to 3 major news outlets and the state medical board at midnight tonight. You will lose your license. Your family's name will be dragged through the mud, attached to a scandal far worse than a lost contract. You will become a case study, Elena. Just not the one you wanted to write. She stared at him, her eyes searching his face for the bluff. She didn't find it. The man she saw was not the broken 27-year-old, nor the paranoid 45-year-old she'd been tormenting. He was something else, forged in both of those fires. A man with nothing left to lose, who had finally found a piece of solid ground to stand on. The river of her certainty broke. Her shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in a profound, terrifying emptiness. The purpose that had driven her for 2 decades was being stripped away, leaving a hollow shell. You've become them, she whispered, a last, weak stab. Cold. Mercenary. Trading in threats. No, he said, putting the phone away. I'm just using the language you understand. The language of consequences. You spent 20 years trying to teach me a lesson about a hostile world. Lesson learned. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone by the churning black water. He didn't look back. He knew she would comply. Self-preservation, in the end, was her primary pathology, too. A week later, the envelope arrived at the lawyer's office. The confession was detailed, clinical, and damning. That same day, Dr. Elena Rossi took a voluntary leave of absence from her practice and was admitted to a private facility specializing in practitioner wellness. Jon stood at his living room window, the blinds open. He watched a police car drive slowly down the street. It didn't stop. The scar on his jaw didn't itch. The victory was ash. He had regained a measure of agency, but no peace. The paranoia didn't vanish. It just had a name and a face now, which in some ways was worse. He would still check the locks. He would still hear a floorboard creak and freeze. The hypervigilance was his permanent climate. But something had shifted. The shadow that had lived inside him, the formless them, had been given a shape and exiled. The nightmare was no longer infinite. It had a boundary, and on the other side of it was her, in a room not so different from the ones she'd imagined for him. He walked to his front door, unlocked it, and stepped outside. He left it unlocked behind him. The autumn air was crisp. He walked to the end of his driveway, then to the sidewalk. He looked up and down the street, at the ordinary houses, the ordinary lives. He was not cured. He would never be free. But for the first time in 20 years, he was not framed by shadows. He was standing in the light, bearing the cold, clear weight of what was real. But in a quiet room in a private facility, under a soft lamp, a different reality was being drafted. Elena Rossi sat at a small desk, her posture perfect, a notebook open before her. The title on the page was not a confession, but a hypothesis: Post-Intervention Resilience in the Permanently Altered Subject. Her pen moved smoothly, no tremor in her hand. The initial conditions had been successfully reset. The subject had demonstrated unexpected strategic capacity. Fascinating. The escrowed confession was a necessary variable, a controlled pressure. Her treatment here was merely a period of undisturbed observation, a chance to recalibrate. She paused, looking out her window at the moonlit grounds. A faint, knowing smile touched her lips. The experiment was not over. It had simply entered its most promising phase. He thought he was finally free. Subscribe, because freedom is